Thank you all for joining us. Today's discussion is going to focus on understanding supply side regulation and public response to SEV adoptions and some of those policies. I'm joined today here by an excellent panel, Gil Tal, Dr. Sina Nordhoff, and Ph.D. student Anya Robinson. Today's discussion will be recorded, and today's discussion is also going to be posted on the EV Center webpage after this. If you have questions, if you're having trouble hearing us, anything with regards to the tech, please make sure to reach out to our ITS team via the Q&A chat. They'll go ahead and try to get you set up. Best case to do, if you're having a lot of issues, it's just disconnect and then reconnect back into this discussion. So to kick things off, today's discussion, again, is going to include our three speakers today, Dr. Ph.D. student Anya Robinson, Sina Nordhoff, who's our postdoctoral researcher here at ITS Davis at the EV Center, and Dr. Gil Tal, who's a director at the EV Center. So today's discussion, we're going to be hearing some overview remarks from Dr. Tal. Then we're going to dive into a discussion on the supply side regulations, what are some of the various levers and mechanisms within these regulations, and then we're going to close out with some results from a statewide survey that are being analyzed by Dr. Sina Nordhoff. Today's discussion is really aimed to have an opportunity, one, to present some of this work, but really we're also trying to reach out to you all for some feedback so that we can improve this research, and also we're looking forward to publishing some of this work in the near future. So with that, I'm going to take a moment here to thank our speakers, but I'm also going to encourage you all that as you're hearing this, to please make sure to populate the Q&A box so that we start getting to some of those questions. If there's questions that we can answer immediately, we'll try to respond to those as we go along, but we're certainly going to try to get to those during the Q&A session. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Tal. Take it away.
Thank you, JC. I will share my screen, and at the same time, I would like to reiterate. Let's see, it's still not there. Seriously, I hope that you see my full screen right now. I would like to reiterate that we are doing something a little bit different this time. We are doing presentations on work that is work in progress, that was not published yet, that is still kind of we shape it. We shape the research question, we shape the analysis, and we are doing it now for two reasons. One, we believe that we have enough results to share with you that can help, but also we would like feedback. We would like feedback on our results. We would like feedback on our research question, on the next steps. And you can give us the feedback immediately now, but you can also follow up with us later. It's a little bit of a risky business. Usually we like to do it when we have everything published and nailed down, but we feel that it's very important and we didn't want to wait for the publications to share this information. So as
Gil, 1 second, we're having issues with your screen. Can you go to full screen mode at the moment from what you're seeing? It looks like a few folks are having issues seeing full slides.
Sharing, let's try and share again. Sorry for the technical issues. I hope that we are good now. Okay. So as we said, we are talking about supply side regulation, and we will talk about it from now. The slides are not changing. And let's start just with the definitions, so we'll all be on the same page. There are many different definitions, but we are talking to them policies and regulation that govern vehicle sellers, manufacturers, importers, etc., not the buyers, by requiring them to meet fleet-wide standards for new vehicles sold. These standards are typically based on technology types, EV, like plug-in vehicles, fuel cells, internal combustion engines, or based on greenhouse gas impact, usually measured as CO2 per mile or per kilometers, or fuel efficiency, in the US mostly MPG. So that's kind of a definition. Let's do a little bit of background of where we are today. That's the work that my colleague Scott Hartman was leading at looking at where are we on the adoption curve, looking at the fleet or the stock side in the countries around the world. And we are in very early stages in most of the world, and Norway is the only one that is way ahead of everyone. But let's think about between now and 2050. We just finished a new study that looking at the stock of light duty vehicles, not just electric vehicles around the world, and thinking about what happened when the economy around the world is good, not bad economy, but between very strong to good economy. And this is the US map. Between now and 2050, we'll see a little bit more vehicles on the road in the US. That's the blue line. And the number of gas cars, of ICE vehicles on the road is going to shrink, but the number of electric vehicles is going to substitute. And it's a nice picture that we would like to see everywhere of substitution of gas cars by electric cars. But it's not the same all around the world. If we look at India, for example, we have two scenarios here. On the left is very strong economy, on the right is just a strong economy. And the blue line, again, is the total number of vehicles on the road. India today is about less than 100 vehicles per 1,000 people, cars or privately owned cars, but it's going to grow dramatically in the future. And then most of the electric cars that will join the fleet based on the government commitment will not replace gas cars in early years, but actually will add to the mobility of the Indian people. This is a great thing, but we have to remember that most of the EVs that will join, doesn't matter if it's a strong economy on the left or a little bit lower, but still growing economy on the right, will not substitute for the next 20 years, and we start substituting for ICEs, for internal combustion engine only later. If we combine all the 80 plus markets around the world that we analyze and try to look how the global market will look like, let's look just on the left for a second. We see that the number of vehicles on the road will grow from 1.5 billion to 3 billion, maybe a little bit less, but growing dramatically. The number of internal combustion engine will stay more or less the same, 1.5 billion, but will start going down only 15 years from now. Even so, the number of EVs is growing dramatically. Now, without the EVs, the total number of gas cars will grow dramatically. So it's not that it's not doing anything, it's preventing us from getting even more ICEs on the road. Thinking a little bit about climate change, about greenhouse gases, this is crucial that we will get these EVs on the road. So I'm working on it for more than a decade, and there was a big paradigm change. The old paradigm was that the demand policies will drive supply. New policies that create education, incentives, and infrastructure will create demand. The demand people will knock on the doors of the car dealers, and they will tell the OEMs to make these cars and to create supply. That's really didn't happen globally. The new paradigm on the right is that supply drives both supply and demand. So people, not just buyers, are telling the policymakers, the politicians, please help us do the change. They create supply regulation, the topic of today. The supply regulation all car companies need to build more cars. That create both supply and demand for EVs. It's really, really hard to measure it. We usually measure who wants to buy, who is buying. It's much harder to measure the impact of supply regulation. And we have a couple of projects ongoing. One is looking at number of cars for sale in different states, Section 177 states that have that mandate or not. Another one looking at the European market and looking at the penalty saving per EV by meeting the supply regulation. Over there, it's a CO2 gram per kilometer. A third study look at the differences that the regulation create by state or location. But it's a very difficult topic to measure. So just to frame the discussion and to help us focus on what we will see today, supply side regulation may be critical first step but are not the only policy. We are not arguing in any way that they are the only policy. We need to still support demand, to include local, regional, and global equity consideration, to support infrastructure, to support the supply chain, and probably many other topics that I left out, but it's not the only thing. The second kind of framing is that different design of supply side regulation will yield different impacts on the market, on the buyers, on the OEM, on the greenhouse gas, and so on. And that will be part of the discussion today. And the third framing is that the ultimate goal for supply side regulation may, but not necessarily have to be a ban on gas cars or 100% EV sales or something like that. So it's two separate, connected discussion on the policy itself and the final goal of the policy. Just as an example, California is going for 100% ZEV, which will include, even in 2035, 20% plug-in hybrids. And I will stop here. We will go for the next two presentations and take questions later. But if you have any questions, start typing them in already.
Thank you for that, Gil. I do see a few folks with their raised hands. Again, we're encouraging folks to please use the Q&A box in, thank you, Ali, for populating that. The Q&A box here in the Zoom webinar, so we can begin to address those either in a written response, or we can bring it up when we get to the Q&A session. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Anya. Anya is a PhD student that's exploring and looking at supply-side regulations, the various mechanisms and levers, and a little bit more about what are the impacts of these different supply-side regulations. So with that, Anya, take it over.
Cool. Thanks, JC. Just put my slides up. Okay, thanks everyone for joining today. So yeah, as JC said, I'll be talking about US vehicle supply side regulations as it relates to our decarbonization goals. So sort of to begin with, I'll be talking through what a supply side regulation is and comparing some of the SSRs, supply side regulations that we have in the US. And then I'll go into a bit of a policy considerations discussion. So to kind of orient ourselves before we get into what an SSR is, we can kind of think about sustainable vehicle policies as falling into one of three categories broadly. So the first category are these demand side policies, such as purchase incentives for EVs, and indirect incentives like HOV lane access. Then the other category we can think about are our supply side regulations, including things like our sales standard, like we have in California, and our greenhouse gas and efficiency standards at the federal level. And then the third category is this infrastructure category that relates to public funding and fuel policy. So yeah, today we'll be just focusing on the supply side stuff, but these other categories are important in our transition to decarbonization as well. So like Gil said, a supply side regulation aims to increase the availability and affordability of goods and services by regulating the supplier. And so I'm going to take us through the three main SSRs within the US, sort of starting with the ZEV sales standard that we have here in California. And I'll be presenting, like these programs are already sort of implemented at a state and federal level. So I'll be presenting the new kind of targets that have been finalized this year at the federal level for efficiency standards and greenhouse gases, and the Advanced Clean Cars 2 program that we're going to move into next year for California. So this graph here on the left shows the targets for California from model year 2026 through 2035. And I'm sure most of you are sort of like familiar with these goals, moving to 100% ZEV and PHEV sales by 2035. And just to be really clear about what that means, if we think about these cars on the right representing all of the California new vehicle sales in a given year, for model year 2028, we want half of those vehicles to be electric. And then by 2035, we want 100%. So moving on to the next SSR, that's the corporate average fuel economy regulation. That's at the federal level. And this graph on the left shows the finalized rule for model year 2027 to 2031. And we can see on the vertical axis that this is a fleet average miles per gallon. So it's across all new vehicle sales within the US. And again, if we assume that the vehicles on the right are our entire fleet for a given year, in 2031, this means that we want the combined car and truck MPG average to be 50.4 miles per gallon. And that means that some of the vehicles in our vehicle fleet will need to be electric, and that's denoted by miles per gallon equivalent, MPGE. And then finally, we have our multi-pollutant regulation, which the greenhouse gas sits within that regulation. And these are the targets for model year 2027 to 2032. And we can see again on the vertical axis that this is measured in grams of CO2 per mile. And again, it's a fleet average. So for 2032, some vehicles may be over that, some may be under, but the average, combined average will be 85 grams. And again, this means that electric vehicles will need to be in the fleet to meet these standards. And we count electric vehicles under this regulation as having 0 grams of CO2 per mile. So to kind of compare across all 3 of these supply side regulations, we've sort of talked about the metric already. The fuel types that are being regulated within these standards differ. So for the sales standard, the technologies that are being regulated are battery electric vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, and plug-in hybrid electrics. And then efficiency and greenhouse gas standards regulate all fuel types, so all vehicles. And then we also touched on how we sort of count EVs across each of these standards. But for a sales standard, it's credit-based, and usually more credits are given based on electric range, or less credits are given based on the drivetrain. So for example, a PHEV would receive less credits than an all-electric car. And then if we think about the technological neutrality of each of these standards, because the sales standard identifies specific technologies that it regulates, it is not technology neutral, but the efficiency and greenhouse gas standards are. And then CARB, NHTSA, and the EPA respectively are the regulating bodies for these standards. And here is just a non-exhaustive list of regions in the world that have already adopted these standards. And so now we sort of understand like the broad targets of each of these regulations. Let's talk a little bit about what is contained within each of the regulations. So these regulations can be thought of as sort of made up of individual sections, which we call design elements. And on the left is a list of fairly common design elements. Again, it's by no means every design element that could be included, but these are the main design elements that tend to be included in SSRs. With those flexibilities highlighted there, I refer to flexibilities provided to automakers to be able to meet these targets. And so we can think about design elements kind of like a switch with a dimmer. So the light switch is whether we include that design element or not. So do we turn the light on or off? And then the dimmer is how stringent or strong do we want this design element to be? And we can kind of make changes to each design element to change the stringency of it. And so we've kind of talked about targets and how they relate to all vehicle sales for a given year. But actually, each manufacturer has its own target or own standard for a given year. So how does that work? So to determine an auto manufacturer's like individual emissions or efficiency target, we use these things called vehicle curves. So we measure grams of CO2 per mile or MPG, but for this example, we're using it's an emission standard. And we also use the vehicle footprint size. So as an example, an auto manufacturer that has small vehicles would have a lower emissions target or a lower grams CO2 per mile target than an auto manufacturer that had larger cars. And this logic also stands for auto manufacturers that sell trucks, but the vehicle curve is moved up, allowing for more leniency with the emission standards. And then if we think back to our analogy of the light switch and the dimmer, ways in which we can sort of make this design element more stringent, so turn up the dimmer. The first way is that we can flatten the curve so that these larger vehicles still have to comply with more stringent emission standards. And we can also move the curve down. And so this gives you an idea of how targets differ across different auto manufacturers. And I believe this was their targets for 2022. And so now that we have a target, let's get into talking about some of the flexibilities that car manufacturers have available to them. So again, we've got our standards here from 2022, and the orange dots here show what the car manufacturer actually emitted. So for example, we can see that Honda's target was just over 200, it was 213. And they emitted 207 grams of CO2 per mile on average across their fleet for that year, meaning that they were under their standard. And then we can see that auto manufacturers on the right were over their standard. So the auto manufacturers that are in blue here might want to, would generate credits, and the auto manufacturers in orange would generate deficits. And they might want to trade amongst each other to be able to be compliant with their standards. But another way that they could also reach compliance would be by banking credits or banking deficits for future years. And so another example of ways in which we can sort of change the stringency of the design element is by changing the number of years that an auto manufacturer can bank a credit or a deficit. And so now that we know sort of the targets of the SSRs as well as what's kind of contained within SSRs, let's have a chat about kind of policy considerations. So there is this tension between wanting a flexible regulation that allows auto manufacturers to meet their targets in a way that kind of reduces the burden on them versus having like a simple policy that is easier to understand and implement for the government. So some merits of flexibility is that it accommodates different capabilities and circumstances among regulated entities. It also eases maybe financial, technical, and operational burdens. In some cases, it can be economically efficient. And I guess one of the downsides is that a more flexible or complex SSR may have some unintended consequences. And then merits for the simplicity side would be reducing monitoring and enforcement burdens for the regulating entities and reduce compliance burden for the regulated entities. And so another discussion point is this idea of determining whether an emissions or an efficiency regulation should be implemented in an area. So we can kind of think of the greenhouse gas standard as well as the ZEV sales standard as being an emission standard. And here in the US at a federal level, of course, we have both, but each regulation kind of has its own pros and cons. So I'll take you through them now. So for greenhouse gas standards, a pro is that there is a direct relationship between the metric used to measure the supply side regulation and the reduction in emissions. And then some cons are that this regulation counts EVs as 0 grams per mile, so it doesn't account for upstream emissions, and efficiency isn't accounted for either. And then for the ZEV sales standard, there's a direct relationship between the metric used and EV sales. It's generally considered a more simplistic policy design, so it's kind of easier to implement because it kind of specifically outlines which technologies to move forward with. And then on the cons, it doesn't regulate gasoline vehicles. It also doesn't account for efficiency or upstream emissions. And then finally, with the efficiency standard, there's a direct relationship between the metric and increasing efficiency of passenger vehicles. It assigns a miles per gallon equivalent to EVs, which is useful. And then, of course, on the cons, there's no direct emissions reduction goal, and it doesn't account for upstream emissions. And so this final policy consideration that I'll talk about today is relating to stakeholder response. So here at the EV Centre, we've done some work looking at feedback provided by auto manufacturers based on public comments from the CO2 regulations in the US. And we've kind of compiled some broad themes that I'll share with you now. So auto manufacturers generally support regulatory alignment. What this means is that having the CAFE and the greenhouse gas standard aligning is generally something that the auto manufacturers want to see. And they also want to see alignment across state and federal policies. There's a desire for increased flexibilities, which might include multipliers or additional off-cycle credits or credit and deficit banking. There's concern for the feasibility of the timeline, especially with more recent ambitious targets being published. And then there's a desire to strengthen the supporting policies. So those are the consumer incentives and the infrastructure-related policies. And so just sort of to wrap everything up, supply-side regulations are a promising pathway to decarbonization for passenger vehicles. They allow us to stock the shelves for consumers, and they're generally a pretty understudied area of research. So the EV Centre is really making it a focus of ours to conduct more research on this area, and that kind of leads into Sina's talk, but I'll pass it back to JC. Thanks.
Thank you, Anya. Just a quick note, I do see a few questions in the chat, in the Q&A box. Please make sure to continue to populate that. We will try to, if we are able to respond to them by writing a response, or we can come back to it and make sure that we address it verbally here at the end. I do want to make sure that I give time to Sina for our last presentation of the day on some of the research that continues to dive into some components that are not very well investigated out there. And so we're here at the EV Center, trying to tackle some of these questions and look into these issues a little bit deeper, specifically looking at how is the public reacting, or what are the perceptions from the public and public response to these types of policies. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Sina. Well, sorry, before I do that, one last thing. I did see a question in the chat about whether or not these slides and this presentation as a whole will be available. It will be both on the EV Center webpage, and it will also be on the ITS Davis webpage as well. So we'll make sure to have a recording and the slides as well. With that, Sina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, JC. Yeah, welcome to our webinar. Very nice that you joined, and I'm very happy to share some of our latest findings on a survey that was distributed to people in California in order to investigate not only their level of policy support for 100 ZEF policy, but also other topics related to their travel behavior or other topics also to ZEF policy. Project was led by my colleague, Scott Hartman, and I had the pleasure to look at the data and to really understand, okay, what is actually, what do people in California actually think about this policy? To what extent they support it or oppose it, or to what extent they are undecided, neither supporting or opposing. Why do we have to look at this topic? We need to gain the support from the public for such a policy in order to meet our targets, in order to contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And we know from the past that if we do not gain this public support, policies may fail, and this have negative consequences on various dimensions. So gaining the public support and minimizing, or first understanding our position is very critical. Therefore, we looked at data that I will, of course, explain also a bit more to explore the reasons for support and opposition. And how did we do that? So I mentioned already that we conducted a survey, and we analyzed a subset of the data that was collected with this survey that was distributed among people in California. I mentioned that already, from low priority population. The data analysis was conducted in 2 stages. So we have both qualitative and quantitative data analysis methods in order to make each analysis part stronger, so to speak. So first we started with a content analysis. So you can see the question that people also received about the requirement, and they had to rate their level of support to the requirement that by 2035, all new vehicle sales have to be ZEVs. And then they can rate their level of support. We can see that on the next slide, the results, and then they got a follow-up question to motivate their decision. So to motivate the level of support. For example, when people opposed the policy, we asked them, to explain, why do you oppose, or why do you support, or why you are more or less neutral in the sense of neither supporting nor opposing. And in order to understand a bit better, what are actually the factors associated with policy support, we run an ordinary logistic regression model. And here we also looked at the other survey data that was collected with the survey and included variables in the model that we could also identify in the content analysis. So let's look at the level of support. Now let's look at a bar plot that shows the responses to the question, to what extent the people support or oppose the requirement. And here we can see, the picture is not quite clear, right? We see that the responses of respondents are quite evenly or uniformly distributed across all response categories. So there's not a clear trend or a clear pattern, but support seems to be mixed at this stage. 46% of people are supportive of the policy, 37% are opposing. Then we have 17% in the middle, meaning that they indicated, they neither opposed nor supported the policy. Okay, now, as I mentioned, we asked them, why? What is actually behind each of this rating that you could see in the slide before? So why do you, for example, strongly oppose? Why do you strongly support? So now let's look at the findings for the support, the reasons for their support. And here we can see that, yeah, you see a bar plot, and you can see that, okay, several reasons for their support. And if you look at the guide at the right, you can see that, okay, it's mostly about the environment or sustainability issues. So we coded the data. So you can see, for example, some examples, a quote, for example, from a respondent saying it's better for the environment. And this was coded as positive environmental impact of EVs, not specified. So here we can see that people mention the positive environmental impact of EVs as reasons for their support in terms of also reducing oil dependency or greenhouse gas emissions or local air pollution. Or we also identified topics related to the problem awareness. This is a theme that we came up with based on the data that, based on the responses that people gave us in the open text box question. And I also want to stress, I did not mention that explicitly in the beginning, we chose this open text box design because there's so little knowledge on the level of policy support, not only in California, but also globally. So we know little about the reasons why people support or oppose the policy. And that's why, for example, an open text box design was very suitable to understand this topic, to explore this topic. So the theme problem awareness relates to the problems associated with the use of with transportation, mainly the use of ICE vehicles. And people, for example, say, okay, global warming or climate change. Or another respondent said, okay, transportation emissions comprise a significant share of emissions overall and contribute to climate change and local air pollution. This was, for example, then coded as problem awareness. Okay, let's look now at the reasons for opposition. And here we can see, wow, the picture looks a bit different. First of all, maybe a first takeaway message, the reasons for opposition, yeah, we have much more reasons for opposition, and it's much more diverse. So we have issues related to the vehicle, to the EV domain specifically. I want to describe it as such. For example, like, okay, limited range or purchase price, which is still considered a barrier to adoption, or the charging time. It takes still longer to charge such a vehicle compared to an ICE vehicle. We also have other familiar candidates, such as limited charging availability, especially in rural areas and on longer trips. Or also interesting was that people mentioned the performance of the grid to handle the additional energy demand that would occur when we have more vehicles that need energy on the road. Also very interesting, and this is quite new for us, was the finding that the social issues were also very important for respondents in terms of, okay, the policy is considered a governmental overreach, limiting their freedom as consumers to purchase the vehicle that they want. And that's also related to another aspect that people were concerned, okay, what are actually the practical ramifications of such a policy for my vehicle ownership of my ICE vehicle, for example? Can I still own it, or do I need to replace my ICE vehicle and buy an EV? Of course, these are the perceived threats among consumers, but we have to take that very seriously. And I want to also indicate that in the end, that education or information can really help here to mitigate these concerns. Okay, you can see here the trade-off, let's put it like this, the tension between individual and social issues, and we need to really address both individual issues and the social issues in order to gain policy support. So it's not only increasing the performance of the vehicles or the performance of the grid, but it's also about understanding and addressing the concerns of consumers in terms of, for example, governmental overreach, or also, for example, when it comes to the life cycle of EVs, what happens to the battery vehicle production, recycling process, etc. Also, another topic that that was mentioned by people opposing the policy was that they perceived the environmental impact as negative or unclear. That's something that we can also discuss in order to understand, okay, what do we need to do in order to address those concerns? So now these were the results of the qualitative analysis, and now we also run a logistic regression model in order to get a better idea of the different associations between independent variables that you can see on the left and our dependent variable, which is on the right, which is the support for 100% ZEV policy. And here we can see, I will not go into very much detail also in light of the time, but here we can see that people working in the EV domain, they might be familiar with some candidates that were positively associated with EV adoption and interest, for example, such as living in urban areas, in our case, was positively associated with policy support, or having a master's, doctorate, or professional degree was also positively associated with policy support. Or, for example, self-reported access to home charging. That was also found to be positively associated with policy support. And this, I think, we can also find to a large extent in the EV literature domain. Interesting for us was the finding that the number of vehicles in the household was negatively associated with policy support. And here we are still looking for explanations. Of course, we have already some plausible explanations that we consider plausible. Also happy to discuss that further. For example, people owning a larger number of vehicles in the household, they may have ICE vehicles, and they may have a special relationship with their vehicles in terms of considering them as a hobby. They like to drive, they like to do, they love their cars more or less, right? So this could be one possible explanation for why we find a negative association here. Also interesting was for us the finding that a low waiting tolerance in terms of having to wait is an annoying waste of time. This is how we measured that, was negatively associated with policy support. And here, for example, it does make sense, right? Because as I mentioned before, the time to charge such a vehicle is still longer compared to an ICE vehicle. And here it might be interesting to also look at interactions between low waiting tolerance and other personality characteristics that might explain this attitude. We also, in order to show you the full list of variables that we included in the model, we also want to stress that we, of course, included also age and gender, but we did not find a significant effect of these variables on policy support. So we also found a number of non-significant effects. For example, also access to level 1 charging stations within close proximity of the respondent was not significant. And now what can we take away more or less from this first impression? So now remember the gray bar plot where we see these different that the responses for level of policy support was quite evenly distributed among all the response categories. So here we can see that, okay, the picture is not clear yet, right? So support is still mixed. Most of the reasons for support were related to the environment or sustainability, which is, of course, also a very important implication for us. Could not identify economic or functional benefits related to policy support. And now remember the colorful bar plot with many more reasons for opposition that do not only relate to EV use. Here we can see, okay, we do not only need to address the individual issues related to EV specifically, such as range, time to charge, or charging availability, but we also have to make sure that the policy does correspond to the values that people have regarding governmental control and And here we can maybe also provide a positive outlook, because we can see, of course, yeah, we have many reasons for why people oppose, but we can also look at this positively, because most of the reasons in principle, with a lot of work, can be addressed, such as limited range. Of course, it's hard work, but it can be in principle addressed if we also have work in tandem with other factors like charging availability or purchase price. But we have to investigate to what extent, but for example, the values of people might be harder to change. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. Also, this we have not shown yet, but it was also quite interesting that those people who neither support or oppose the policy, they openly said, hey, you know what, I don't have enough information or knowledge in order to form a solid opinion, but I'm extremely open to change with more information and education. So here we can, of course, also, and I will actually look at this, address this now. Here, of course, we can look at the role of information and education to investigate, okay, what do those people actually need who are undecided, who are who do not have yet a stable opinion, but who might change with different information. And the same goes, of course, for people who are more on the negative end. How can we address those concerns, and what do they need? And this is something that we really think is very important to address by future research. Make maybe focus groups or interviews, bringing people together in order to understand, okay, what are their concerns and how can we address those? Also very important is the correlation between EV purchase intention and policy support. That's something that we want to find out, okay, to what extent does intention also explain level of policy support, something that we could not identify yet in previous research. And yeah, as you might know, the sample was now limited to households in California. But of course, we have other very interesting markets to look at, other US states and Europe, or other markets that are very important for us to consider, or China. So to what extent are those findings that we find here, to what extent do those hold also for other states or countries? And something that we also find interesting to consider is, okay, now to what are the differences in how consumers respond to the policy itself or the target? Because now in our description of the policy that we more or less gave to respondents and to which they reacted, we mentioned the 100% target, which of course is the very extreme end. And this might imply a ban of ICE vehicles in the future. So so this is something that future research can take into account. And then, of course, the longitudinal effects over time, as there's really hardly any literature on a ZEV policy. And so we would be very interested to explore to what extent the level of policy support changes over time, and then also considering the different factors that we, for example, mentioned in the beginning, information, education. I think that was actually my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention. It was nice presenting.
Thank you, Sina. Thank you for the overview. 3 excellent presentations today. I see more folks populating our Q&A box. A few of them are being responded in written form. One of the things that we are encouraging folks is, again, this is work in progress, analyzing some of these results, continuing to explore SSRs are something that we continue to do. And so we encourage you all to provide us with questions, but also feedback as we continue to develop this work. I think at this point, we want to shift over to more of a discussion. We are going to get to some of these questions in the Q&A, but maybe to kick things off, just a couple of questions here to the folks in the room. For Anya, one of the things that you mentioned is that this type of work, these types of policies are really gaining momentum in governments abroad. And so what are some of those, perhaps, how are other governments abroad really incorporating, or how are SSRs in the US shaping some of those policies in other places? And I know you're doing some of that work already.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, JC. Yeah, so I guess like just to begin with, like JC said, this is kind of ongoing work here at the EV Center. And so something that a group of us are working on, including with Dr. Tal, is looking at what we can understand about global supply side regulations that exist currently, and then taking that knowledge and creating kind of a toolkit that provides other countries, specifically developing countries, with the tools that they need to then go and build their own supply side regulation. So on one of my slides, I kind of listed a few of the other regions globally that have been adopting these regulations. So for the CO2 standard, that includes places like Australia, and then Japan and Korea also have their own supply side regulations. And so we're taking the knowledge from those regulations as well. I will say the European Union is a really big one as well. And putting that into a toolkit that we can then give to policymakers. And so we're in the stages of analysing all of those policies currently, but we will sort of be doing the same thing that I took everyone through, is looking at the design elements, how they differ, asking questions about how we might increase stringency or increase flexibility, as well as looking at like the context of the countries themselves. And so, yeah, it's an ongoing piece of work. I don't know if Gil had anything to add to that.
And we just add that today we focus on light duty, but very similar policies are coming to heavy duty, California, US, and around the world. The light duty market is more a little bit more mature, as we saw in the beginning, but not much. But the heavy duty is following up very fast with very similar topics on the design, but on flavors, and this is also on our long to-do list.
I see the question from Dana, and you kind of tackled some of it, Gil, is that these learnings that are, how do we see these learnings applying from SSRs to private vehicles? How is those translating to other segments of the market, whether that's public transit, buses, fleets, or even e-bikes? And of course, you touched on heavy duty vehicles, but there's of course a whole other segments of the market that these can be applied to as well. Anything else?
I will just say that big part of what Anya is doing on this tool is to see who is regulated, how can you regulate them. So for example, when we talk about e-bike, do we have designated suppliers, manufacturers or importers that you can actually measure their sales? Can you actually regulate them? Is it already out there? And these are the very important first steps in understanding supply side regulation, to understand if it's the right tool for this question.
Yeah, excellent feedback. There's a lot of activity now in the Q&A. Some kudos to excellent presentations today. I do want to ask a question to Sina, specifically around which metrics were significant when analyzing the data from the survey, which weren't. You mentioned there was one that jumped out as you that was very significant, which was this idea of how many vehicles are in a household. Was there any other ones that, as you were looking at this data, you said, this is interesting that this is significant for this particular question?
Yeah, great question. I think as this research is really first or exploratory in nature, because we know so little about this topic in general, we can say that actually we were very fascinated by all of the results from this ordinal logistic regression model. Of course, people working in the EV domain, we think, of course, yeah, wow, this we already know from EV adoption, for example, that people living in urban areas or that people with a higher educational degree are more positive towards ZEV policy. This is something that we know. Also, we found that people owning an EV, they were also more supportive of this policy. So this was very fascinating for us. And regarding the negative effects, yeah, as you mentioned already, the number of vehicles stood out, having a negative effect or was negatively associated with policy support. And I guess this is also a very sensitive point for consumers, that they want to know, okay, what happens actually to their vehicle that they currently own, because we know that car ownership is related to many important to economic growth or employment, etc. So it is a very sensitive issue that we also have to take into account. And also, of course, it's not only important for for employment, but also they just like their cars, their ICE vehicles, and to some it's a hobby for them. And then, of course, also related is the finding that the policy was considered governmental overreach, limiting their freedom as consumers. Okay, I want to decide myself which vehicle I buy. I think those themes together are very important to consider for, in the next study, or also by stakeholders involved in,
I would like just to kind of reiterate what Sina was saying is we are in an uncharted territory right now, and we did something that is very not common in surveys. Asking why and opening a text box, just type in why. We usually give you 5 options or agree, disagree, and you kind of move it from agree and disagree, but we tell you what the answers are. You just tell us if you agree or disagree. In this case, we just say, you said that you support this policy. Why? You say that you oppose this policy. Why? We end up with different answers than what we were expecting. We end up with people who answer on the wrong policy in a way. They were thinking that we are going to take their cars out of their hands. This is really, really important for us in order to understand how to ask it in a more structural way next, as Sina said, so we can do better job in not just knowing what the topics are, but also quantifying it. But this was first survey, and we did this really kind of risky, opening it to why, and it's amazing work that Sina is doing on analyzing it and bringing it to the different groups. And it's not simple task. And I think that from there, we can just take it and understand more the number of people, the topics, and so on.
Thank you. Thank you for that framing. I do see a couple questions here that are looking at some external factors that weren't necessarily explored in these discussions today. And a lot of it has to do with the upstream critical minerals that go into these components in building and manufacturing EVs. That's certainly something that we're also looking at. That wasn't really touched on in these presentations, but certainly other folks here at the EV Center are looking into what is happening, how is those trades of those minerals being facilitated in different ways, and more importantly, the end of life and the end use of these components. So certainly something that we're also tackling. So looking at EVs throughout its lifespan. I want to tee up Ale, if you can hear me. There is a individual, if they're still here, maybe we want to unmute them because they've had several questions. I want to give them an opportunity to just quickly maybe ask a question here. I believe it's John Graham. If you want to maybe quickly 15-30 seconds to ask your question here, and or any comment that you have, and we'll gladly address it. If you can find John Graham and unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. By the way, those were wonderful presentations, and I was very intrigued to hear the responses from the California citizens and residents. I'm interested in this question. There's a lot of talk in the campaign right now about how these supply side mandates for electric vehicles, how they might hurt the U.S. auto industry, not just the auto assembly industry, but the whole supply chain and the dealer networks and so forth. And this seems to be like it's actually politicizing electric vehicles a lot in the Midwest and in the South. And I'm wondering whether you guys have any information on whether electric vehicles as a technology are unfortunately becoming more politicized.
The question, if we know how much it become politicized, we are following it, and as you said, it is becoming more politicized, and that's it's a very important question for us in the future. Do people will buy this car because it's a good deal, or will not because they are on the wrong side? It's in the wrong side of the political map, and that's something we will have to keep studying. Another set of projects we are not doing it now, or we're not doing enough of, is to look at the impact of SSRs on the economy and the market and so on. I showed a couple of projects we're doing measuring the impact. I don't think that it's going to kill the industry or any of those, but for sure there are balances that need to be done. And a lot of what Anya presented on the flexibilities is part of this work.
Thank you. Having a hard time keeping up with all of the questions coming in, which is good because we have a lot of activity, but there is questions here. I want to tackle this question from Richard. Is it T-Bay? In the survey that is the data is still analyzed, by the way, still more records are coming in as we sent out paper surveys. So people still responding to paper surveys. If we asked folks if they had friends or family who own or drive an EV, an important part of sort of the EV ecosystem, right? Having that sort of exposure, a community that interacts with the individual and gives them sort of a first exposure to an electric vehicle. Then I do believe that in the questions that were in that questionnaire, there was that particular question: do you know people, or are you aware of folks that have an EV, or have you ever been in contact with it? Not necessarily you purchasing the EV itself. So certainly part of that instrument. Yeah, any other thoughts? I'm wondering if there's any questions that you all are looking at that you all want to tackle or respond.
A lot of good questions that we need to read while. So Arthur asked a couple of really good questions about if we looked at the mandate versus ban, increasing supply versus requirement and regulations. These are exactly, I think, our next questions. This is, I think, very important, as Sina already kind of talked about. The way we ask it this time is we talked about ZEV mandate to 100%. So we talked about the end goal, but maybe people are totally okay with supply side regulation, but they're not happy with the 100. Maybe they're okay with 90. Maybe they're okay with having one EV per household. That's perfectly okay, but EV only households is where they feel uncomfortable. There are a lot of questions that we didn't ask, but we feel that are very important and need to be answered. Because as another thing that Sina was talking about is this change over time. The support or opposition for this kind of policies will change dramatically as the market or the demand at the level of the market is growing. And in California next year, we're going to see about 35%. It's not going to be, or 2026, it's not going to be a big jump in California, but other Section 177 state will see much larger change in the number of EVs that they will sell in 1 year. And we would like to be ready to test all of that in the coming year.
I'll figure out who's next here right now.
And also, I think if people want to raise their hand and unmute themselves, we can also take that.
I see that John Kassab has a question. If we wanna unmute John, or John, if you're able to unmute yourself. So Gil, when you were talking, we couldn't see you because you're there we go. Now we can see.
I'm there.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Hi,
I think
John.
I accidentally pressed hi. I think I accidentally pressed the button. I don't actually have a question, but thank you very much for the presentations.
Well, thank you for joining us either way. Let's see if we can tackle some of these questions. There is a question here from heavy emphasis on household demand, but more attention is necessary on the supply side interviews or surveys, as well as fleet owners. This is a comment, I think more than a question, from Anise. And Anise, if you're still here, did you want to elaborate a little bit more on that comment?
Yeah. Unmute yourself or Alan?
I see her on here.
All right. Hello.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi.
I just I was under the impression that we are looking at the supply side regulation, and then I was listening to the presentation, and there was all these consumer demand surveys. Demand is part of it, of course, but then on the other side we have the suppliers who, in response to demand, they take action. And we have seen, for instance, some of the suppliers, OEMs, that did identify targets for themselves that was consistent with a lot of regulations that we have in place. But then more recently, they have all made a change. Some of them have made a U-turn, and some have modified it. And so because my understanding of the topic of this conversation was the emphasis on supply side regulation, I was thinking that there is something to be said about the OEMs and others, as well as the fleet owners, about these supply side regulations and how they respond to it and how they incorporate the interaction with demand into their decisions. And but of course the surveys that we have access to are mostly demand side surveys.
So thanks, Anise, for clarifying it. Now I understand better what you're commenting on. So we did not present any demand side today, but what we presented, or the presentation that that was about the survey, was about the reaction to the supply side regulation. So we are, in this case, it's not about your willingness to buy an EV under one price or another, but do you support the government regulation to regulate the amount of supply you will get on EVs every year, which is not a survey about if people would like to buy it, or at least this part of the survey is not about if they like to buy it or not. That's a very different section here. Now, our analysis of the OEMs, and that's something that Anya was presenting, was also their reaction to the supply side regulation as part of analyzing their comments to the regulations that they submitted. I think in this case, it was the EPA new regulation. So we looked at what changes they are asking and in what way in order to make this regulation better to meet their goals. And then the third thing about it is that we are looking here at a very, very different market, because the meeting point between supply and demand is already being prescribed by the regulation. So if the ZEV mandate is asking for 35% EVs next year, or 50% in a couple of years, now the study we need to do is very, very different. It's not who would like to buy EVs next year or who would like to buy EVs in 2030. It's out of the 50% EVs on the dealer lot, who will take the 50 EVs and who will take the 50 gas cars. So our surveys of willingness to purchase and the discrete choice models that we were doing for many, many years that were looking at the sensitivity to pricing and so on. Now we need to redo them, looking at a prescribed supply for each year. And this is where I think we need new tools that you probably can be very, very helpful in helping thinking about how to design these new tools.
Thank you.
Anyways, there's a few more comments with regards to the externalities of EVs. Some people focused on the safety aspect, certainly something that is still being considered. And EVs there is an element with regards to its connection to social challenges, especially when you're talking about what that could entail in urban areas. And so that is certainly, safety is still certainly something to consider. I see that Richard Tabay has mentioned he has a comment here. Did you want to go ahead and unmute, Richard? You're still on.
Hi.
Yeah.
Thanks
Hi.
for the presentation. It's been really interesting. I started to write it in. I remember seeing something a decade ago or more that said only about 20% of the population had purchased new cars within the last X number of years, and that 80% were buying cars in the secondary market. So I guess my thought is that it's, part of it is you're focusing on a narrow segment who are going to be purchasing new vehicles as opposed to those who are going to be in the used market.
You are absolutely correct on your observation that most of the Americans are buying used cars, but all the used cars used to be new one time. And in order for people to buy used EVs, we need to secure the supply of new ones. So supply side regulations create this supply for the entire market to grow. We are not including in this presentation today and in this study, for example, how we support used car buyers on their warranty of the battery, on the end of life of batteries, on making the right price, how we make sure that the new buyers will be repeat buyers and will create enough used cars, that we will not create policies that will make them buy one EV and that's it. All of these topics are critical for the success of this transition to a clean transportation, but they're not, at least not directly part of supply side regulation. They are kind of second effect and so on.
I think that's also going back to a question for you. As you continue to do this work and analyze SSRs, not just locally, but also abroad, any new questions that arise, interesting observations that you think are opportunities for more research leading into the future?
Yeah, for sure, like every day. But it's like I said, it's a pretty understudied area. Like historically, sort of researchers have focused on more of like the consumer side of things for electric vehicles. So some of the things that we're hoping to focus on here with our supply side regulation research is number one, like I mentioned earlier, looking at how other countries are implementing supply side regulations. And then number two, quantifying the effectiveness of supply side regulations. So what I mean by that is, we have lots of different policies. We have supply side policies, demand side policies, infrastructure. And the question is, like, to what extent does the supply side policy drive electric vehicle sales or drive the reduction of vehicle emissions? And so being able to quantify that. It's a difficult question, but it's something that I'm really interested in looking at, because it kind of gets at, are supply side regulations actually effective? And to date, really no research has looked at quantifying that question. And then I suppose something else that we kind of want to know more about are like spillover effects. So when we move to 100% electric vehicle sales in California, like what will be the impact of that policy? Are people going to be looking out of state to buy gasoline vehicles since they can't buy them anymore in California? What does that look like? Safety issues, all of those things as we move to 100%, the sort of questions that we're looking at.
Are Reno dealerships going to be a popular destination?
I hope not.
I want to kind of touch on a comment that was answered by one of our colleagues here at the EV Center, Scott, to a question that was brought up by Katie. Katie mentioned, I'm curious as to why many consumers stated limited charging availability as a reason to oppose car regulations, but then number of level 1 or DC charging stations within a 15-minute drive did not have significant impacts on policy support. And Scott, who is part of our EV research team here, he highlighted this point that people kind of see what they want to see on the road, right? And so people may not be aware of the presence of EV charging stations, even if there is one there in a second. I'm gonna tee up Gil because I know he has a little bit more insights on this, but we did there was a point in which we found no relationship between the presence of charging stations there and whether or not people actually have seen the charging stations. Gil.
That's a great topic. So there are two different things here. One is maybe I will be a little bit dashing on other research I've seen out there, that people measure how many chargers are about 15 minutes or half an hour from your home as some kind of factor to being, like EVs more. In reality, I would like to have 2 minutes from home or like 500 yards from home, a charger, preferably 50 yards, like at home, but not far. So when I arrive at home, I will have a charger there. If a charger is 10 minutes from home, it's much less useful for me. The next one I would like to see is the one on the way to my road trip, which may be 2 hours from home, that will be useful. So even if I live in downtown Sacramento, not far from here, and just a couple of blocks from me, there are a lot of commuter chargers that are a little bit too far for me to leave the car there overnight, and they're closed on the weekend. That's really not helping me. So we need good home chargers, people that can charge while they're at home, and then we need this charger outside. And then the second topic you talked about that Scott and other Kelly and others were working on is, do people even notice this charger? And I have to say that a lot of the results today on the survey, and Sina was talking about it, is about knowledge and about, have people already done the homework on what is the mandate? What are EVs? Is it right for me? Will I save money? Will it cost me more? What will happen without this regulation, and so on? So a lot of it is about people who answer our survey making assumptions. And we need to, it's very, very hard for us as researchers, as social scientists, to keep slicing in and figuring out not just what they answer, but why, and keep getting deeper and deeper into the why part. I've seen another comment there that I would like to react to on a little bit different topic. And the comment was the impact of supply side regulation on the car manufacturing, on the market, on cars from China, and so on. And the easy answer is always, this is a different research topic. We're also studying supply chain. We're also studying battery manufacturing. We're studying all of that. And that's correct. But at the same time, it is very clear that the supply side regulation creates this pressure for building a lot of EVs and building them fast. This pressure is tilting kind of the field through importing of cars, even if you don't get the full IRA and other incentives, or bringing them batteries from other countries. It's also create a lot of investment. So a big part of what supply side regulation creates certainty about the market size. And the certainty about the market size then can be used by the car companies to design their supply side, to design the battery supply chain, and for us to design the infrastructure and so on. On the other end, it's not a one number. We're seeing right now that in the EU, the gram of CO2 per kilometers, many OEMs are shifting the way to tackle the new jump in regulation for 2025 by creating more hybrid cars, not even plug-in, but hybrid cars. So by improving their entire gas fleets in order to slow down the ramp up of EVs. They will go for EVs, and in the end, they will go to 100% with the current regulation, but they can play with the steps and how it will change in the next couple of years. And these flexibilities will help them to be more efficient. And that's a lot of what Anya is working on. It will help them to be more efficient. It will change the impact of China, of nearshoring and so on. And it need to be all kind of estimated together. And this is something that we really believe that it's a future research that we need to take into account, how to estimate this impact all together.
That's good enough. I want to make sure that we do end up on a positive note. We're getting close to time. I want to ask Sina a question. I know that the research and the analyzing the data is still ongoing. We're still receiving some more responses, so a lot of work for some of our undergrads there. So there's still a need to reach out to communities, to folks that may be unaware or don't have a full understanding of these policies. So you mentioned this idea to provide that information. Are there some strategies, some ways that you're already thinking of that could be a good way to reach out and better inform and reach out to communities that could make use of that information as we move forward and try to get to these goals?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, of course, it's very important to develop information advertising campaigns, for example, or to host workshops or events or webinars, for example, also with members of these communities. But I think the first step is really for us to now do the second step, because now this was the first step to explore the topic among a limited sample. And now we really need to do the second step, for example, to do some interviews, because this was, as Gil mentioned, based on an analysis of an open text box question, which of course yielded so much insights. We also want to stress, for example, that around 1,600 participants provided us with their explanation for why they support or oppose the policy, and we were really grateful to see such rich data, because overwhelmed actually by the data, because you can really feel, okay, there's really much thought and effort put into that. And I think now we need to go first to the second step to, for example, explore this a bit more qualitatively with interviews or focus groups where we can bring different people together. And then this input, for example, can inform the development of some information advertising, marketing campaigns, so that we really address their needs. And also want to stress, by the way, the plots that you saw in this today, they were based, we have also more topics for their opposition, because I saw a comment from someone, some of you mentioned that, okay, we should also, for example, study participants in rural areas, and they have specific vehicle needs, such as a pickup truck. And this was actually also identified by our respondents as reason for why they oppose. They said, okay, I like EVs, but I have specific vehicle needs. I need a truck, etc. So yeah, we are definitely also aware of that, and this is actually also included. And if, for example, the manuscript is out, we are happy to share the preprint. before publication, and then of course dig into that, doing more research, and then maybe host a nice event together with members of these communities.
Certainly. Again, trying to end on a positive note here. Now, I'm going to tee up here the panel, maybe a spitfire around what's next for us in terms of this work that continues to sort of drive us forward, and this sort of positivity to move on or move into this electrification phase. I want to follow up on Sina's comment about making sure that we're outreaching to communities. One thing that I was involved in that project, one thing that we did was provide these opportunities and host these sessions to reach out to communities across the state, some of them in person. And I think what was really helpful for me to get a sense of what's going on in communities as they gain more understanding of this transition towards electrification. It's really providing information to communities in their communities. And in this particular opportunity, we went to the Bay Area and provided the information in Spanish, which is also something very valuable, I think, to reach out to folks in that way. So for me, that's up our work continues. For folks, I don't know, we'll start at the end. Or Anya?
I guess what I am interested in understanding more about SSRs is sort of their unintended consequences to vulnerable communities and disadvantaged communities, and research more ways that we can sort of change the regulation to prevent these unintended consequences from happening. Of course, it's an understudied area, and then disadvantaged communities are sort of even less studied. And so this is like a really important topic that I would like to dig a little deeper into.
Get the paper out. So that would be very nice. But of course, then I would be also very interested in understanding, and this is also what Gil mentioned already, how do actually those beliefs form? So which information contributes to the development of these beliefs that or perceptions that people have about ZEV policy and or EVs? For example, do they talk to their neighbor about it? Do they read about it in the media, social media? Or how do they actually get the information, and to what extent this information also is processed by them, and to what extent it influences the perception and acceptance of EVs.
I think that what we learned both from analyzing the OEM response and people response, that there is a positive push for supply side regulation, when we just hear from everyone that they want to make it better, more efficient, and more clear, make sure that everyone is benefiting from it, both on the industry side and on the consumer side. So our work in the next couple of years will focus on how to make supply side regulation work even better and more efficient.
Sounds good. A lot of work to do. Thank you all for joining us. For those of you that stayed for the full hour and a half, thank you again. If you want to stay up to date with our activities here at ITS, you can join our mailing list. If you want to be up to date with future EV webinars or anything related to the EV Research Center, you can scan that QR code. I'll make sure that this works here in a second. But again, appreciate all of your input, appreciate all of the speakers today, and we hope to see you on the next one.
Thanks.
Thank you.